All right, gentlemen. So far we've spent a bit of time talking about Konosuba along the lines of like the parody versus satire distinction. But one question I actually wanted to ask you all is, how do we interpret Konosuba? Because it's definitely an anime that is different than our usual fare. We're used to doing these like very like critical thematic analyses of like the anime that we watch, and Konosuba is by at least a few measures a difficult anime to read in that way. So what do you all think? Silver, I know you had some thoughts.
I did, and I will touch up on this, but actually something that I just thought about that may actually help talk a little bit more about how to interpret Konosuba as a story is the fact that I've heard this from other people who have had mixed reviews, not overly negative, but just not overwhelmingly positive reviews of Konosuba. And I feel a lot of that stems
Me.
Yeah, certain someone here. But like a lot of it stems from I feel like there's more in you have more of an ability to interpret and more enjoy the story and the narrative that is happening if you have prior experience with a lot of isekai, and also particularly like anime that kind of have game thematic like stuff in it, like for example SAO anime, kind of like that kind of deal with like game mechanics, or it is literally a game, they're isekai'd into a game. And if you don't have that background to go into Konosuba, there's gonna be a lot of like missed jokes, a lot of missed like references, a lot of things, and I feel that does hinder it a lot of it. So it's kind of hard to actually interpret Konosuba without that, which makes it seem. But so for me, I view it more in the lens of an RPG, not because I am a gamer. It definitely also helps with that, but I feel that is like in large part what the author was going for, and there have been clues and hints about that from literally the very first moment of the entire series. Kasuma literally dies because he wouldn't have to go buy a game because he's been binging gaming for 3 days. Once they're in the world, it's like literally like game-esque when Kasuma is getting when he's deciding whether to pick a cheat or pick Aqua. He literally says, my gamer instincts are kicking in, blah, 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 blah. And just different moments throughout the show. And not all of them come off the top of my head, but like one in particular was like the pause button. That happens every once in a while, particularly when Aqua is doing something stupid. And literally at the end of season 2, the entire thing is, thank you for playing at the end credit. And at the end of season 1, or at the very, very beginning of season 2, it starts off with like a game loading screen, and you have to click load your save file, and you have to put in your password to get into it. So I feel that for the most part, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's the framework that the author is going for, and it's definitely the easiest to interpret the game as, the world as. And I definitely have more enjoyment of Konosuba, not just because I love comedy anime, but because I am viewing it through the lens of this is an RPG. And you can also see that in how they go about quests and how they just randomly come across high level bosses like the generals or whatever. That is very much a RPG thing. You're just wandering, doing random quests to level up, and you just happen to run into the main storyline quest while you're there on accident. That is a huge trope that does happen in real life. So that's how I interpret that. That's my 2 cents on the whole RPG thing.
Yeah, and going off of that, it's funny that you mentioned that, because that's how kind of I look at Konosuba, not just as comedy anime, but I'm okay, if I was watching some people play some video games, how would I feel about their moves? So I don't know if y'all ever watched Dan Harmon's, he does this Dungeons and Dragons things with some random comedy people, or if you ever just watch gamers on YouTube play games. That's kind of how I view Konosuba, and it does take it to a new level. It makes it funnier, and it kind of makes it hard. I'm oh yeah, this is an anime. Should I be looking at it like this? But when I'm oh, this is the party's decisions. What's better for their moves? What are their stats? They talk about their stats in different times, and I'm oh yeah, no wonder you shouldn't do that. You're just hot trash. What type of character is this? And different archetypes we mentioned before, oh, if you're gonna be the tank, you should have done this, or if you're gonna be the mage, we need this instead. What are we doing? Just bring Yunyun in the game. That's all we need. But it definitely does take this anime to a different level, and it does shape the interpretation much differently.
And like interestingly enough, right? So you brought that up, Texas Ranger. I mean, both of y'all have been speaking to. I would say these are even parodic elements, in the sense that like, there's like an adoption of like the style or the form of an RPG. And I think very clearly we see that through like the different members in like the party, right? So you have Kazuma, who's kind of like the jack of all trades, like master of none. You have Darkness, who, as you pointed out, Texas Ranger, is like the tank.
Yeah.
And then you have Megumin, who's kind of like the glass cannon. She like uses that like incredibly powerful spell, and then she's like completely useless. And then you have Aqua, who is like the healer, like the support character. But it's very interesting to note how there's like an over exaggeration, right? And this goes back to like the parodic elements, but there's like a like over exaggeration of like these different qualities. And in some ways it's kind of funny because at times like there's like a mixture, there's an ambivalence. Like sometimes it helps them advance along. Ultimately it does help them advance along their like quest or their like main journey, but there are definitely moments where like the different like I guess like highly like specializations or like roles or what have you like actually lead to like ironic like effects, if that makes sense, which is actually something I've somewhat been thinking about. Not to sort of like go too far in the opposite direction, but there's like a level of irony. I'd like recently realized this. There's like a level of like irony like all throughout like Konosuba, at least as pertains to the main cast, in like the kind of like commonsensical way that we might refer to irony. Like say Silver goes to make coffee, but when he gets there, there's like no coffee grounds left, so his like ideal has been like thwarted. Like what he wanted to do was thwarted by actions that were completely out of his control, right? So like that's like in the commonsensical way that we might like use the term like, oh, that's ironic, or that's irony. And there's a layer of that with like the kind of, which is kind of connected to like the like what we discussed earlier about like the whole like wish fulfillment like aspect of Konosuba, because there's like this like very like this like layer of irony that like confounds each of our like main characters. It's like they're like constantly like acting in ways that are that can be perceived by us as like ironic, and that's like very interesting in the sense that like that's like an aspect of like the humor of Konosuba. Anybody else have any other thoughts?
So on my end, actually coming into the show, like I had always heard like from the general ramblings of the discourse about people being like, oh, it's an isekai that breaks down isekais, and it's like taking all the tropes that you love from RPGs and all this stuff. And I did see the game elements involved, as Silver pointed out earlier, as the show went on, and I was like, oh, mostly that to hype up the comedy. I guess the thing that this show really opened to my eyes is that like I consider myself someone who plays like a lot of video games too. Maybe it's not as much recently as I did in my youth, just because of like going to school and all that. But like I have not touched like the world of fantasy, like RPGs, MMOs, and all that stuff almost at all. Like I have vague ideas of like the typical RPG, and oh, you fall into a magical world and like you have to stop the personification of Satan in this world because and all that stuff. But it opened my eyes to it's like, yeah, most of the RPGs I've played have been a lot more, how should we say, not in that sense of fantasy, like been a lot more like the Persona series takes place in modern day, or they're like action RPGs where the focus is less on the role-playing elements and there's role-playing elements included along with like an action game itself. So like, as we kind of talked about before, some of the stereotypes and some of the jokes people make, and the way this show is like targeting certain people, like Kazuma himself is someone who plays these games a lot. It's like, oh wait, this is going completely, like, if not over my head, it's not hitting me on that fundamental level of like, oh yeah, that thing does always happen. Oh, look at this twist. Because I want to say I was reading just stuff on Reddit just to understand, like, oh, just certain aspects and why certain characters are loved. And, like, one thing everyone saw about Megumin is just like, oh, the reason we like Megumin so much is because we've seen this type of character so many other times, like a million other times before, and now just to see a new version of it is so sweet and blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, wait, I have literally never met a character really like this, or I can't recall one, so I guess to me the novelty isn't hitting. This is literally probably my first interaction with, like, small mage girl who thinks she's more mature than she actually is. I'm like, oh, I guess, sure. But that's just me. And I can understand how that framing keeps the show in a different light than someone else coming into it.
Well, that, yeah.
Right.
That makes sense.
I think it's interesting to note, right? So a lot of your critiques seem to sort of come from potentially like that source, and then there's sort of like the more like critiques at like the level of narrative that you sort of laid out base. And I think taking stock of those, there's an interesting question to discuss about like the differences in evaluating like a comedic work versus like a, you know, quote unquote serious work of art, if that makes sense. Not to say that comedy can't be serious, but y'all sort of get what I mean.
Yeah.
And, you know, Silver and I were having this discussion, right? I think I've sort of revised my thoughts a little bit on it, but Silver and I were having this discussion about how in the kinds of analyses that we typically do on the show, they tend to be like thematic analyses, or they tend to be like, you know, sort of like analyses not necessarily limited to themes, but analyses about the broader truths that like a narrative is like aiming to convey or is like functionally conveying. And it's an interesting question to sort of ponder whether or not like that's the like objective of comedy, you know, whether or not like that's something that comedy strives to do, like to convey a series of truths, if that makes any sense, right? But I will say that I've sort of like you know, and then that as like a like reason for why it might be like a little bit more difficult to you know, like pinpoint themes in Konosuba, but like an interesting sort of revision to that line of thinking that I recently came across is that, well, you know, I think ultimately, like, you know, it's probably more a matter of like emphasis with like a narrative like Konosuba, because I was really starting to think about it, and I was like, well, you know, maybe it's like quite similar to the way that other isekai or like a general like theme that is communicated, but I do think it's like apt to say that like Konosuba does like aim to like communicate that you know, this sort of like there is like a quest for meaning, you know, like the escape is like a quest for meaning, you know, and like the way that meaning sort of gets like, you know, arrived at in Konosuba is through like adventure, but also through like relationships, right? And that sort of like is like an interesting thing to reflect about, in particular as it pertains to the different like opportunities that Kazuma has to go back to Japan, right? And maybe to reflect over. I haven't necessarily given it too much thought, you know, but like on the one hand, like he's like offered like, right, like an opportunity that seems to be like what's dangled in front of his face, right? Like an opportunity to go back and like become like a like wealthy person, like someone with like a lot of like fortune, and yet there's like an interesting point there about or just like the possibility of going back, and there's like an interesting point about, well, like why does he choose not to go back, right? And like thinking about it at like a thematic level, it's like, well, like maybe there is this thing about the fact that like, you know, he has found meaning in this like alternative world, and in this like isekai world, in a way that it was like absent in his like day-to-day life back home. So these are just kind of things that I've been thinking about as far as like, you know, what like the objective of like, you know, comedy is, and like what the objective of like humor is, and all that. I don't know if folks have any thoughts in as regards those comments.
I mean, so I'm gonna try to leave out some sort of the things I talked about with you guys, like off recording, where I was talking about like some of the more literal plot questions I had and stuff like that, because I don't think it's necessarily as pertinent to this discussion, to figure out like the literal plot of like what literally expositionally happens. But from what I've been like thinking about and like trying to figure out what others are thinking about, and in the discussion over the course of even this recording of this podcast, is I feel like there's always like two sides to when people talk about like Konosuba. Like on one hand, a lot of people will say, "Oh, the plot doesn't mean anything," but then the other hand, the plot does mean things because it's still there to facilitate the actual like messagings of the show, and you still have to have a structure. And then also, and personally my end, I don't like to think ever like, oh, you just disregard the plot as a storytelling device. It's like, no, it's just that the plot sometimes will be sacrificed for the sake of comedy or thematic value, which doesn't inherently make it any worse. It's just not like a plot heavy show, like something episodic like the Looney Tunes or the Animaniacs aren't plot heavy, but their episodes do have plots and they do proceed in a way, so they're still important. When it comes to themes too, there's always also this double side where a lot of people say like the themes that like you brought up of Kazuma learning to live in a world where people actually depend on him and finding his actual place in amongst a group of people he genuinely cares for. But then on the other hand, it's like, does he care for these people? Like, is it still serving some sort of, even though Kazuma himself is not the brightest or smartest or most all-powerful person, does it still serve some sort of power fantasy? That's the discussion I've seen, where it's like the rejection of the power fantasy in itself is still a power fantasy. And I was just like, oh, that's some levels of irony I'm not ready to dive into yet. So I worry that like, am I taking the themes too shallowly or too deep? Because on one hand, I'll be like, oh, the themes are like, yes, we all have our weird quirks and fit together, and you have to find your place and be in this world, and there's enjoyable moments to be had in between all the bad. Or am I looking at it too shallow and just being like, oh, it's just for comedy and that's it? Or is it like there are deeper themes of like the growth of a hero and what it means to like relate to others and like, oh, like triumphing over evil and all this stuff? And at that point, I'm just like, am I taking this comedy too seriously? And that might be the dichotomy that the show itself intends to create, that sort of mix between, oh, there are deeper things you could reach for, but you can also enjoy the silly surface level stuff. Maybe that's itself a theme, that no matter how deep and dark the world gets, there is good to be had in the little enjoyments that you can have. Oh my god.
What a good segue.
My brain, it's expanding.
No, really, really good segue, actually, to speak about a couple things that have been on my mind. And, you know, I've done a little bit of research into like comedy. And I think it helps to think of like comedy in like contrast to tragedy, which it's, you know, it's kind of funny, right? So I mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast when I mentioned that I watched like Fate Zero and Konosuba in like a like relatively like similar like period of, you know, like a relatively like short period of time. But, you know, there's two things that come to mind. And, you know, as I was like reading this like philosophy of like of humor like lecture series to sort of like prepare for like this like podcast, right, that came across like a number of ways of thinking about comedy and thinking about comedy in relation to tragedy, right? And so I'll just kind of like shoot off a couple of different things that I think speak to what you were
but before you get into that, I want to know, when you say comedy and tragedy, are you talking about like those classical, like when we were in high school learning about like the classical Greek or like Renaissance era, Shakespearean era definitions of like the genres of comedy and tragedy? Or were they looking at it in the colloquial way someone might call something a tragedy or a comedy?
Yeah, so I'm gonna get to that.
Okay.
Definitions. So it's interesting to note, right? Like kind of like the like at least in like in like the West, the kind of like roots of like thinking about like comedy versus tragedy are attributable to like Aristotle, of course. And this is sort of his like way of thinking about it. What I kind of gathered both from reading the Poetics in the past, but also reading like this like lecture series, right, is that he sort of has like an aesthetic like theory of comedy, and like it'll become clear what I mean by that as I continue talking. But he basically sees like comedy and tragedy as like two different like art forms, if that makes sense. And both of them like communicate like a different aspects of like the human experience. So comedy, sorry, so I actually backstep. So tragedy, right, as we sort of spoke about in like the Fate Zero episodes, is like very much like in the classical Greek sense, like the whole like the hero who starts out is like very noble, and then like through like some sort of like fatal flaw like demonstrates like kind of like the like it's like they are undone by like this fatal flaw, like their harmatia, and like the audience goes through this like process of like catharsis, blah 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 blah, by like watching it, like where we like purge our like negative emotions through like watching the the tragic play or what have you. There's like an interesting add-on to that, I think, by like more about by like more like modern like philosophers of like comedy versus tragedy, that sort of like has this like notion that like tragedy teaches us about perseverance, which I think is like it's very like real in a sense. This is like these horrible things happen to the hero, and then like the hero continues to like live afterwards. The hero perseveres afterwards, typically speaking. I'm thinking here of like Oedipus or what have you. And then on the other hand, like comedy is kind of like, instead of showing us like, this is the Aristotelian like kind of view of comedy, but comedy starts off with like someone who is like a representation of like the different like flaws of like a human being, like someone who is like like a clown essentially. But I guess in like the more modern kind of views of comedy, there's this like idea, the kind of like adding on to like the Aristotelian like kind of like aesthetic theory of comedy, that like comedy teaches us about like overcoming obstacles through like creative actions. So like the comic hero is, and in this way this is very true to form to Konosuba, right? So like the hero does like very like absurd or like ridiculous things, and like the hero is like fundamentally flawed, and yet like they like are able to overcome, they are able to like advance, and there's like sort of like a resonance there for us, like a message for us that like we are also able to like overcome and advance through like creativity, which is like interesting, held in contrast to like the common view of like comedy as just like non-serious like enjoyment, or like non-serious like entertainment. So that's like one thing. And then that's like sort of like the aesthetic like view of comedy, or like the aesthetic, or like one might add like moral dimension, like an aesthetic, but like one might add moral elements to it as well. And then there's like this super interesting like kind of like existential view of like comedy, which I think you hit on base just naturally talking about it. But it's this like notion that like the natural state of things is tragic, like the natural the natural order of like nature is disorder. Human beings, like we spend our lives kind of trying to like cope with like and learning over and over again that like we have these like ideals, but like reality like bumps up at all turns against our ideals and sort of like breaks them down, or like we go through these like tragic experiences or whatever, like that's like the flavor of reality. And then comedy emerges as like an existential response to that condition that allows us to like through like jokes and like through like finding humor and like mistakes and like unfortunate events to actually like equip ourselves, like cope with what happened and to equip ourselves to actually continue living, which is like it's very interesting that would just sort of like organically pop up as we were talking about Konosuba. I don't know if folks have thoughts on that. I know that was a lot, but I don't know if folks have thoughts.
Are you saying we're all dead on the inside and we only laugh to mask our inner tragedy?
That's literally the only lines I need in an autobiography.
Oh my god.
We are in a perpetual state of entropy.
I wonder how this fits in, because like from what I can remember, some of my funnier moments of Konosuba, or just like when I think about things that make me laugh in general, I mostly identify with usually what it is like something absurd is happening, right? And there's one person, this is a very classic comedic bit, the straight man, straight as in the comedic person, not straight as in the sexual orientation, but the straight man is reacting to the absurdity. And whether that reaction is something like, I don't know, you see it all the time in Konosuba with Kazuma's just like blank, aggravated stare when something ridiculous is happening, or like I think of like Ron Swanson from like Parks and Rec, that I haven't watched but I've seen enough clips of that, or the main character that Jason Bateman plays in Arrested Development, where it's like something absurd is happening and then the normal average person is just like, what? Why is this happening? And I wonder if does that person then play the role of the absurd hero, because it's like, are they being absurd when they're just being the normal person while absurdity is happening around them? It's interesting, I guess, when you try to analyze, quote unquote, analyze comedy, because people have been trying to do it for, well, ever. And I don't know if we ever really can, because humor, I think everyone can agree here, humor is so subjective. It's one of the most subjective things out there.
Humor is very subjective, like you said, Base. But I want to actually, this loops back to a point you made about the plot being there and that it's important. Because one thing I want to highlight is that comedy is always contextual. Like, you can't just say a random joke without nothing and then like just get laughs, like, because even like just saying a joke wherever you are still depends on where you are, and it brings in the context. You see some of the best comedians, like we go back to Bernie Mac, Richard Pryor, we can talk about questionable Dave Chappelle, but like they have such good storytelling techniques, and that's what helps that's the setup for a great punchline and a great joke. And I think when we look at Konosuba, even like with Kazuma being a straight man and many other characters being that, we see that the comedy is layered in its plot. So I'm about to connect a lot of points real quick. It's layered in its plot of being an Isekai RPG. With that being said, we said Kazuma being a straight man in a world where there's magic, where there's monsters and everything. That's a joke in itself. Like, that's like, what are you talking about? This should have happened. Why are you? It's acting like it's different. Versus we go into other just comedic elements of darkness being a whole ironic paladin. That's like, a fighter for good and light, but has like, hence her name Darkness, has a real darkness on why she does it. Like, that's a whole joke in itself. And we take this back to what type of comedy or how we interpret Konosuba. I think it's very fair to just look at it as a comedy isekai anime. It does go into deep moments because I think that's part of comedy's life. As Tropical said, comedy highlights the tragedy, and it was a tragedy. It started out with Kazuma dying from being, if we're going to look at what negatives he faced, he represented sloth, he represented gluttony of his entertainment needs, and he died. Like, he just straight up died. So then when he came into this new world, we see him, well, I wouldn't know if we can say he's growing into a better person, but he's growing into the opposite of what he was, because now he's more social and things like that, and we are still looking at a tragedy just unfold, but laughing along with it.
and he's like finding meaning and like as we sort of talked about earlier, finding meaning through like his relationships and his like misadventures and whatnot. I think
Also want to put out there though, there are many times though where he does disregard the meaning. I don't want to still get away too much where it's just like, there are some times where personally, this is just me still thinking about it, where it's like, oh, has he found his meaning? And then for the sake of a joke, they'll kind of throw a wrench in and all the characters will revert back to where they were before the scene happened. And I was just, and those are some of the more,
Oh, definitely.
I'll laugh, but then I'll also be frustrated because I'll just be like, this could have been a moment, but now it's like a different moment. And I guess my struggle is like, am I disappointed in Konosuba for what it's not rather than critiquing it for what it is? You know what I mean?
Also, that ranch is usually called Aqua.
Oh, that's valid.
Yeah. I don't speak the name of the Antichrist, thank you.
he says this.
Yeah,
like,
so I mean, oh, wow, I didn't even think about that. But no, that's like something I see a lot of times when people are criticizing anything. People will be like, oh, it seems like you're more mad about what it's not than you are like in taking it for what it is. And I don't ever want to come off as thinking like, oh, because Konosuba's a comedy, we don't need to take it as seriously. Like, it's still a product, it's still a show, and whatever the intent of the creators, producers, animators, even the original light novel writer is, it doesn't change the fact that the interpretation of the audience is your own interpretation. So how you want to take it is up to you. And I guess in my case, I'm just struggling with how I should take it in my discussions with other people, or where I put it in like my media entertainment brain space, you know?
I think I have maybe some little bit of a piece that I can maybe like help with that, but probably maybe could, maybe won't. The way I try to view about Konosuba in terms of a comedy, and I also kind of view Gintama like this as well, is also like Konosuba and Gintama specifically. I mean, I'm sure there are other comedy anime that kind of would qualify as well, but not so much. Is that they're basically sitcoms of anime, and the reason why I say that is because they're definitely centered, around very strong like characters and like their interactions, but also the world around them. Now you definitely feel like as you're watching it, as you progress through it, season 1, 2, and also with Gintama, is like you're feeling a part of the group. You feel like a part of the community opposed to like other anime that try to be a comedy but are very just like, here are the like individuals that like the comedy is based on, and that's basically like all you get. You don't really get to see them interact with like the community too much. You don't get to see the community change either because of the group or just like on their own, that sort of thing. So I definitely view it as like a sitcom almost, and that helps me like just add on another layer of enjoyment to it, because definitely they even have like loopy soundtracks that kind of function as a laughing soundtrack in sitcoms.
Right. I guess the only thing I would say is that in the past, like, I want to say 2 years, I've learned I shouldn't say hate, but I'm going to say I hate sitcoms.
Yeah.
Just like,
we're talking about personal preference.
Flashback to Full House discussion.
Right. I think it was just something in the past couple of years, just the traditional nature, I guess, of American network TV sitcoms has just really gotten to me to be like, man, this is just not funny. But that's another discussion for another time. I guess, still seeing it as like the anime equivalent of a situational comedy. Here's a situation, comedy happens.
So how do you all, I think Silver sort of already started to get at this, but how do you all see it as like comparing to Konosuba, I mean, to other like comedies or comedy anime?
Oh, I'll start because there's one very important anime that like it always gets referenced to or like compared to, Ray Zero. There's a lot of comparisons to be made there, but a reason why that comparison is funny is because the authors of both are best friends in real life, and they helped each other make the series the way it is. So I think that's really funny. Yep.
Really? Oh wow.
That would explain Isekai Quartet
Fair
more.
comparison.
I just thought maybe they just kind of threw people together and were just like, yeah, you guys have all similar things going on. We'll put you all together. But no, the fact that they're friends. But like, is ReZero a comedy?
No. But like even like they like people compare it to ReZero on the basis of it being an isekai as well, because people try to rank
an isekai that
Konosuba
plays with
more
the
so under
tropes.
the umbrella of like, oh, it's arguably like a lot of people say it's like the best, like one of the best isekai, not so much like one of the best comedy anime. They go with isekai first over comedy, and that's why it gets compared to ReZero a lot. I've noticed.
Yeah, no, I think about that too. I mean, I started watching ReZero at the same time I started watching Konosuba because they're kind of like, I feel like in my limited knowledge of both isekai and comedy anime, they're both kind of two sides of the same coin, where it's like a person goes into another world and it's not what they think, and then they just take that premise in very separate directions, which I guess then comes up to like taste and what you want. I'm also not going to be able to say much when comparing the show to other shows, because I think, as most of the three of you know, I haven't watched actually that much comedy anime, like anime specifically made to be comedic. I've watched shows where there are comedic elements, like there's comedy in Naruto, there's comedy in Dragon Ball, there's, you know, stuff like that where people will be funny and stuff like that. But I haven't really watched too many shows where it's like, oh, the main point of this is to get you to laugh. Like, that is the point. So I guess if someone else wants to take the reins while I still try to come up with like how I tackle it. So I guess from my perspective, I went in with the framework of watching an anime show, and I tried, I guess, watching it the same way I watch most anime, which is just see what happens if I enjoy it, kind of sort of in my gut, but then also think about why certain things I like and certain things I don't like. That may have led to the show, like I said, having that sort of mixed appeal to me.
Yeah. I guess I'll go next in comparing it to other anime, specifically comedy anime. To me, it's still not, I'm not going to say nothing compared to, but it's definitely below Gintama to me. I mean, Gintama is my favorite anime of all time, but it's also the best comedy anime of all time. That cannot be argued. I don't care who you are. But Konosuba is arguably maybe top 2 or 3. I've seen a lot of comedy anime, so I would have to like really sit down and think about it. But it's definitely top 3, top 5 for sure.
For me, when comparing to other comedy anime, also just a fun note, like anime comedy is like real interesting, especially when they're good, because you can like put them in so many different categories, which makes it real different than like American comedy. Like American comedy is just comedy. Like I don't hear the comparison. Like, you know, I'm gonna take The Interview and make it a good drama story as well as a comedy. Like you can't, like with Konosuba, you can say, oh, it's a good isekai, maybe not the best comedy. Like you can put in multiple stances. So that's just a real interesting point that I just thought of. But for me, like when you're looking at other comedy anime, it's funny. It's kind of fun to me. Not the greatest, but it's definitely like, it does slap. Like I know if I turn it on, like I'll get people to laugh. There's other comedy anime that I also have that same effect for, but depending on who I'm talking to, I'll definitely put it in there. So I think it's okay. I don't think it's bad for a comedy at all.
Okay, word. So I think on that note, it probably makes sense for us to transition to like the last part of our podcast, which is just mainly, you know, entertaining a discussion around some of our favorite moments of Konosuba. So
speaking of comedy,
who cares to start?
Ooh, I think arguably my favorite episode was in season 2. I mean, there's so many good episodes, so many good moments. My favorite overall that made me laugh the most was in season 2 when Darkness is about to be married off to this other guy.
Yes, I was just gonna say that same thing.
We have the most epic, one of the like top 5 anime speeches of all time from Darkness.
Oi, Darkness. そのいやらしい体を使ってちょっと金を稼いでこい。畜生！この女はもうダメだ!
That was my same moment. I was just gonna say that.
I watched that scene both subbed and dubbed, and like even in the dub, it's like Oh, it's so. I want him. I can't repeat what I said for fear of the FBI coming in and arresting me, but it is peak darkness as a character because she is so confident too in her speaking. Like, there's usually hints to her personality that like obviously Cosmo sees and no one else sees, and then obviously you can put together what she's actually saying, even though characters wildly misinterpret what she's saying. But that scene where she distills it down to such a clear, distinct set of objectives, I was just like, this is enjoyable. Well, I didn't say it like that. I was more laughing, but like, that's what it was.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about like moments or episodes, I don't know why this sticks out for me, because like when I watched the show, I watched like all of season 1 first, and then I watched the season 1 OVA before going to season 2. But so for me, the season 1 OVA is like is the first time I saw Yunyun, and just that whole episode of like it was quote kind of, it's not the real introduction of Yunyun because that actually happens in like season 2, but like they kind of do an introduction to her in season 1, which I don't know how OVAs work in the context of making a plot. It's whatever. But it was just so funny because I just never seen like this character before other than the OP, and I'm like, oh, I guess she's gonna come in. And just her interactions with Megumin, I was just finally like, wait a minute, are we going to get like a peak party member character? And sure, it did happen like that. But just the entire introduction of her in the store being this flustered but boisterous like force against Megumin. I was dying. I had to pause the episode and like rewatch it because I was just like, Jesus Christ, this is like, I don't know who thought this up. Where are you? Who's out there? Because it was all self-contained too. It didn't like pertain to any like larger thing that the episode was going for. It was literally just Yunyun and Megumin being themselves, and it actually made me enjoy Megumin more because, I mean, like I had said before, up to that point, I'm like, oh yeah, she's a funny character, but I'm not like endeared to her like the fan base.
Fair.
So I think for me, probably like the one moment that sticks out the most, or like the one episode that sticks out the most, and some of y'all already know where I'm going with this, is like the Loli Succubus episode.
Ooh.
Oh my god.
Wait. I bet is it season 1 episode 9?
Yeah.
It's
the only reason I remember.
It's not either 9 or 8.
No, it's 9. Episode 9.
Oh, the reason I remember, you know why I remember. Great episode.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That's the most questionable thing I heard today. Keep going.
It was so funny. And this is actually quite interesting as like a way of talking about a couple things that relate to Konosuba and like the humor in Konosuba. So there's like a bunch of like different theories as to like what makes like jokes about groups of people okay, about like collectives like morally okay or not. One of the very interesting ones that I've seen is like the aesthetic theory. I don't know why it's called that, but that's what it's called, and it's like basically like comedians saying like in order for something to be like, the more, I guess it's like the more like risque or like, potentially problematic a joke is, the funnier it has to be for a comedian to be able to get away with it. And the Loli Succubus episode is, I think, one of those episodes where it's like, oh man, like this is like really like threading the line of like, or like walking that line between like, is this okay, is this not okay? Same with,
it's gonna
like,
ruffle some feathers.
Yeah, it's gonna ruffle some feathers, even though like it's interesting because it's like when you start to like analyze it, right? Like I think there's like a very like easy like kind of like culturalist like SJW, like screaming SJW, not like people who care about social justice, but like screaming SJW way to like see it and be like, oh, this is horrible, like like
reactionary.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. Way of like looking at it. where it's like, oh, like, you know, this is like exploitative of women and blah 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 blah. And then when you start to like analyze like the role of like the succubi in like the world where they have like they're treated well, you know, and they it's a profession that they do. They have like
They're not degraded for it.
They're not degraded for it, exactly. Like they have like you know, relate like strong like relationships of like mutuality with like the adventurers, you know, and like in some ways like they have like, you know, like a social role that's like, you know, important to
they
keeping
have
things
agency.
going. They have
That's
agency
the main
too.
thing,
They have
think so.
agency. Which is like, it's very interesting in that context with like, you know, you think about the whole episode in that way, and then you think of like all the funny moments of like Kazuma, like, you know, like defending like the lowly succubus and all that. And there's like a whole bunch of issues there too, where it's like a dream, but like also there's like, that's one of the points where like you get like really like you are really like walking like that's like oof, man, like with the underage, like it's like no, like obviously like that's not okay, and it's like, oh man.
And then Darkness is there, and it's the whole like thing where it's like, but Darkness usually likes this, but like, is she not liking this because it's not how he normally is, or is she playing the sub role? And you're just like, I'm laughing, but I'm also concerned.
Yeah, and he's like almost forcing himself on her. It's like, oh man, like
No, I still remember the line too, where he's like making the contract and they're explaining the rules to him, and he just leans over. He's like, I won't get in trouble using anyone's image without permission, will I?
肖像権とかいろんなものは大丈夫なんでしょうか。大丈夫です。だって夢ですから。ですよね。
I was like, oh my god. I'm like, you are thinking so many levels deep of trying to keep yourself like in line. I was like, I don't know why that line just like, because you just slid, it's like, hey, just between you and me, like
yeah.
That's
Yeah.
hilarious.
But overall, I would say that's probably like one of the moments that I like really think a lot about, as far as like, this shit is hilarious.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So, do folks have other things that they want to mention?
Ooh, season 1, I think it's like episode 4. I'm thinking maybe episode 5 or 6. I can't remember. When they're bringing back Aqua from dumping her like a teabag in the lake. Well, that whole sequence was funny, but after Kazuma beats Miritsugu, or whatever the fuck his name is,
Mitsugugi.
that Kirito looking motherfucker, he brings up the famous "I'm a true advocate of gender equality," and it breaks out the hand motion. I busted out laughing the first time.
真の男女平等主義者な俺は女の子相手でもドロップキックを食らわせられる男。手加減してもらえると思うなよ。公衆の面前で俺のスティールが炸裂するぞ。
Yeah.
The Cosmo's hand motion.
Yeah, that's like
So
the steel
much
joke.
of the budget went into that motion.
You could literally see the effort being extended. Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, that's like another one of those jokes, like the steel.
It's always this. His luck is just so high. He should take a valuable item, and every time I think about it, I'm like, are they really that these guys are not carrying any other valuable things on. My word, guys.
No, you gotta remember, Steel. He has the highest luck in the world, and he has the highest chance to steal what they view as most valuable to them that they have on them.
Which makes me think, it's like, what are these people valuing in their undergarments? Might there be some secret panty economy that we don't know about in Konosuba?
That should be a whole arc.
Thoughts for later.
Oh my god. You were gonna say something, Texas Ranger.
Yeah, since bringing up Steel, those are one of my favorite moments. Whenever Cosmo learns like a new gimmick or trick, and I'm like, oh, it's just gonna be for an episode, but it keeps coming back. I'm like, why is this coming? Like when he first learned how to steal, I was like, oh, that's cute to learn. At least it was fun while it's here. And I always forget his luck value, but the fact that he uses this so much, coming in, steals the sword, steals this, I'm like, I'm here for all his gimmicks. Learned how to use ice. I'm like, can't wait to see how this is used. Those are my favorite moments.
There's also the moment in season 2 where they go to that one town where everyone's in the cult of Aqua or whatever, and just the constant barrage of like every time he tries to do something, someone just shoves a contract in his face. I was just like, dang, man, it's like the internet but in real life.
Accept these cookies. Give us your location.
No, and then there's a scene too where because Darkness follows the cult of Eris and they hate her. She's like getting pelted by rocks from like little kids or whatever, and it's like, I think it's just like thoroughly enjoying it. The kids are just being so nasty. I'm just like, girl, stop! Like, I'm enjoying this, but are you? Like, no. Oh my god, what? Oh, jeez. It's most of the things when I think about the funny moments though do have to come in the minute to minute, like sort of, like I remember I watched a YouTube compilation of some of the funniest moments also, and just some of the minute to minute stuff where it's just real quick is also funny. Like every time someone's like going like Cosma, he's just like, yep, that's me.
I
That's
am
my name.
Kazuma.
And he's just,
Kazuma desu.
yeah, I am Kazuma. Sure. And he's just saying it while they're ranting in the background. Gets me because that's like also some my thing going back to like reactionary comedy where it's like someone who's being completely serious is just like, yep, I'm over here still saying my name. Yep. What do you want?
Yup. Indeed. So I think unless folks have any like last burning thoughts, I think that probably brings us to a close as far as like this.
I think I have one more.
Oh, go ahead.
Something that, well, actually, it kind of ties back a little bit to the whole like comparing it to other anime, but it's also like a moment thing. There's not one direct moment. It's like for the entire series. Something that is different from Konosuba as compared to other anime. Not all of them, but like most of them. Like you can just feel from the first episode how much fun the voice actors are having, and literally there's like the whole like the one example, all the descriptions that Megumin gets out when she's like about to use explosion, those are all ad-lib. So in the studio when she's coming up with these weird sayings to say, each completely original that they had never heard before, everyone's just laughing their ass off and trying not to like have it enter the mic. And they actually had issues finishing recordings because they couldn't stop laughing. So just that like translates really well into like the quality of the voice acting. Even like Aqua, I know this is gonna ruffle a base's feathers a little bit, but the voice actress for Aqua before Konosuba wasn't really like, she wasn't like that popular. People kind of looked down on her, saying like she didn't have that much range. But then she did Aqua, and then like her like career just like got rejuvenated because of that, and everyone loved her after that. Because there's range in Aqua's voice actors, and you can't deny that.
Yeah, I'll give you that.
Fair.
And like I said, my disdain for the character has nothing to do with the people who actually work on producing the show. Like, I'm glad that she's like found her spot and people do adore her. And like I said, it's a fictional character. I'm not like, my day is ruined because this fictional character exists, and how dare people like this fictional character. It's just like for me. So, and then what you said about voice actors enjoying themselves, I think that is also a prime thing that does come through in certain works. Like when you can tell that the people working on it are enjoying it rather than just, I have to do this. It kind of makes it feel better. Like think about the Lovely Succubus episode. Like it makes me feel better to know that people were enjoying producing this content than like, oh, we're doing this arc.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, sir. I'll do better next time.
Oh no! And she's like, I'm like, this is my fault. I'll accept death. And he's like, no, there's some things a man must stand for.
He just jumps out of his towel.
Oh.
絶対に守るべきものがある
Classic Konosuba moment. So yeah, on that note, gentlemen, I think that probably wraps us up. And to our lovely audience, thank you for persevering with us, especially through these COVID times. We love and appreciate you, and we hope you find. Base, I hope that wasn't a COVID cough, because I don't want you
That
to die.
wasn't me.
That was me.
Oh.
That wasn't me.
Oh.
Every time something happens on this podcast, I want you to know it's always Silver.
Why is
It's
it
always him.
That is
I feel
true.
like I'm getting framed.
That's not a lie.
Oh man, that's quite funny. So on that note, to all of our lovely fans, you know the deal. Like, follow us on Twitter at Boys Anime. Engage with us, talk with us. We're lonely. It's quarantine. We're socially distancing. We need some friends. And we love and appreciate you all. The fact that you continue to listen to the, I guess, art that we produce. And, we'll see you next week. So on that note, I'll let Silver kick us off with not kick us off, say goodbye with our iconic, kind of like send off.
What is it again? Oh, peace, love, prosperity.
So
Peace,
it's
love,
You said silver,
prosperity.
and I was like, what?
the what? The peace off.
Peace, love, swag, everyone.
See y'all later.
Bye.
Yeah.
See ya.